whether it's because of political turmoil while people come to cities, or just on the basis that they see the bright lights and they want to be part of this. So what advice would you have to most of the developing countries that are sitting here who think urbanization is a negative thing and are actually many of them have plans to try and get their people back into the rural areas?
Because today is not a conference focused on urbanization. We're talking about export. And urbanization is a very complicated, comprehensive process. So you have to guarantee that when those farmers come into the cities, they have a job. And that is why when they are still in the farmers, they have to be properly trained or educated in order to get the kind of right jobs for them in the cities. And secondly, the most important law in China is that for those migrant rural labor forces, they still have their land. So they still legally keep their land in the rural areas. So once they come to the cities, they get temporary jobs, and then maybe lucky enough to get the permanent jobs. Okay, they settle down for 3, 4, 5 years, then become a city resident. But sometimes they lose their jobs in the cities. And in some of the developing countries, those lose their jobs, they become part of the slums residents. And that creates a big social problem. So a fundamental safety net, as this lady raised, is that they still keep their land. So once they lose their job in the cities, for one reason or another, they can move back to the villages they originally lived. So they still can continue their farming activities. So this is a kind by the kind of laws that the land cannot be sold out, and they always keep that land. That means the government buy a kind of insurance policy for them, that if worst come to the worst, they lose their job in the cities, they still can come back to the rural areas. So you see tremendous migration of the labor force in China. In the Spring Festivals at the Chinese New Year, you see 200 million migrant labor force migrate from between cities and urban areas. I can tell you in the early stage of the financial crisis recently, there are about 70 million labor force from the countryside in the cities lost their job because of the export decline. So 70 million moved back to the rural areas for about 3 to 6 months until the international market improved. So they moved back to the city again. So we have this kind of policies that they still keep that land. So they have the options to come back to the cities, to the rural areas. That can prevent the kind of slum and the kind of people who once have the job but lose their job, and the kind of vulnerability of this kind of situation. And of course, now we are creating a kind of social security system in the cities for the time being. And they can still enjoy that kind of social security policy once they temporarily move back to the rural areas. So these are very comprehensive policies we are introducing, and the city Chongqing is make a tremendous experiment for the urbanization. Maybe we still lack of experience, but I think this process is going on quite smoothly, basically. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have another question for Mr. Long?
Thank you. Yes, I have a follow-up question on that key issue. You mentioned in your talk that one of the key things, of course, is for people who have jobs in the urban areas. Without that, their situation is difficult. To what extent have you developed schemes to allow people to set up small enterprises? To what extent is China using microfinance type initiatives, as have been tried in other countries, including Bangladesh and elsewhere, in order to enable people to set up their own business and to get a stable livelihood while being in the urban areas? Thank you.
I think you are raising a very important point that in China, 85% of the jobs are provided by small and medium-sized enterprises. So we are encouraging that those people moving from the rural areas to the cities to start their small business in the cities, to run a small restaurant, to run a small shoe repairing store. So the kind of entrepreneurship that is embodied in our farmers is very important, because you can hardly rely on the government solely on their jobs. Of course, the reason why I said is that export is important for the job creation is because China's labor-intensive export products has very big competitiveness, and because of the very low cost of wages. And that is why we still believe that labor-intensive products of export of China will continue to be very important for us. Of course, some of the labor-intensive products is moving to other countries. I think that's what Mr. May already mentioned. But China basically is still a developing country, so labor-intensive product is still very important for us. That is why we still believe that the kind of rural labor force moving to the cities should first and foremost go to the labor-intensive factories, and that, to some extent, very much rely on the international market. Thank you.
Mr. Long, would you accept a final question before we know you have to leave? One from the center of the room. I think there was a question here at table number 6.
Mr. Long, my name is Mwape. I'm a permanent representative for Zambia in Geneva. I have an interest specifically in the multilateral trading system. You opened your statement by referring to some comments that seem to suggest that there is no fair global trading in as far as China's share is concerned. Now, I believe that the only fair way is to conclude a multilateral trading system. And therefore, there is a need for us to conclude the Doha round, urgently. Now, one of the reasons that have bogged the round down is because of the U.S. demands on countries like China. I would like to have your thoughts on what it will take to close this, because indeed what results from the deadlock is that countries like LDCs are the ones that are suffering the most, because they cannot reap the benefits of the decisions that have already been taken, such as DFQF, which is not being granted, especially by countries like the US. Your comments on this?
I think you should have asked Pascal Lamy, who was here yesterday. And, but I firmly believe that open trade is the solution for everybody, from the most developed countries like the United States and LDC countries. I think this is kind of a firm belief and firm convictions I have had during my 10 years negotiation for China's WTO accession. Because for China, WTO accession, it was a very, very complicated process. There were very strong trade protectionist tendency in China at that time. And so we have to overcome many, many protectionist ideas from various departments and various quarters of the people. But after 10 years of China's WTO accession, we see that China's made tremendous progress. Now I can tell you 99%, maybe it's too much, 90% of Chinese firmly believes that open trade is good for them. And because this open trade is not only good for China, but also good for China's friends in the developing world. Because when